The car pulled right into our driveway, exactly at the minute the message predicted. And when I saw my wife go pale like that, I understood my entire life was about to fall apart right at our front door. But let me back up a little, because I need you to understand how I got to that moment. My wife left her phone on the kitchen counter at 6 in the morning, and that's what started destroying my life. I've never been the type to go through my wife's phone. I always respected that boundary. But when it buzzed 3 times in a row while she was in the shower, something inside me just broke, like my body knew before my mind did. 9 years of marriage, 2 kids, a house we built together brick by brick, and I always believed I knew every inch of that woman. I grabbed the phone without even realizing what I was doing, and the notification on the screen just said, "Coming in 10 minutes, leave the door cracked like yesterday," from a contact saved as Trainer Jim. I stood there frozen, trying to come up with a reasonable explanation, because that's what we do when we love someone. She came out of the shower, saw my face, and asked what happened, and all I did was hold up the screen without saying a word. She let out a nervous laugh and said, "Oh, that's just my trainer confirming the time. You know how he's always late." But I knew that laugh, and it wasn't the laugh of someone telling the truth. I asked why the message said, "like yesterday." Since yesterday she'd told me she was home all day waiting for the plumber. She froze for half a second before saying it was probably an automatic message. Except I'd seen the timestamp on their last conversation. Weeks of deleted messages, leaving behind only that one notification she forgot to erase in time. And that's exactly when the car stopped in the driveway, right on schedule, and my wife walked to the window, her face completely drained of color. My wife stood frozen at the window, her face drained of color. And for a moment, neither of us said a word. The only sound in the house was the car engine outside cutting off in our driveway. I walked past her before she could stop me and opened the front door myself. And there he was, a tall guy in gym clothes, gym bag slung over his shoulder, already smiling like he'd done this 100 times before. A smile that dropped instantly the second he realized I wasn't supposed to be the one answering that door. He took a step back like he'd walked into the wrong house entirely, his eyes flicking nervously toward the driveway, as if he were already calculating how fast he could get back to his car. "You must be the trainer," I said, and my voice came out calmer than I felt inside, which somehow made the whole moment worse for both of them, because calm wasn't what either of them expected from a man who just caught his wife's secret arriving at his front door. He stammered something about having the wrong day, the wrong address, some excuse that didn't even finish forming before it fell apart in his mouth. But his eyes kept darting past me toward my wife, who was still standing there, wrapped in her towel, gripping the door frame like it was the only thing keeping her upright. I asked him plainly why he had a door code that let him walk in without knocking, since that's exactly what "leave the door cracked" meant, and he had no answer for that, just mumbled that he should probably go, and practically ran back to his car without looking back once. I shut the door and turned to face my wife, and that's when the lies started stacking on top of each other so fast I could barely keep track of which version she was telling now. First it was, "He's just overly familiar. That's how he is with all his clients." Then it shifted into, "You're twisting this into something ugly because you don't trust me anymore." And within minutes, she was crying, actual tears streaming down her face, insisting that I was the one destroying our marriage by being paranoid and controlling over nothing. I stood there watching this woman I had shared a bed with for 9 years turn my own discovery into my crime, flipping the entire situation until somehow I was the villain standing in my own hallway, and something about how smoothly she did it, how naturally those tears came on command, made me wonder exactly how many times she'd rehearsed this performance before tonight. Then my phone buzzed in my pocket, cutting through the noise of her crying and my own racing thoughts. It was a text from my sister, someone my wife trusted completely, someone who had been over for dinner more times than I could count, someone who had held our kids as babies. And the message read, "We need to talk. It's about her and that guy. I should have told you months ago. I'm sorry I didn't." I looked up at my wife, who was still wiping her eyes. still pretending to be the wounded party in all of this. And I realized she had no idea what was about to land on both of us. I felt the floor tilt under me. 3 months. Not weeks, not days. 3 entire months of my sister carrying this secret while sitting at our dinner table, while watching our kids play in the backyard, while hugging my wife goodbye like nothing was wrong. I asked her why she waited until tonight, and she said she'd been trying to get proof, something undeniable, because she knew if she came to me with nothing but a hallway sighting, my wife would spin it into a lie so convincing I'd doubt my own sister instead of my own wife. She said she finally had it. Screenshots. A whole thread of messages she'd pulled off my wife's old laptop when she borrowed it to print something last week. Messages that went back even further than the hotel, back to before our youngest was even born. I walked back into the living room, and my wife was sitting on the couch now, arms wrapped around herself, staring at the floor like she already knew what was coming. I asked her, very quietly, if she remembered a hotel downtown 3 months ago. Her head snapped up, and for the first time all night, she didn't have an answer ready. She just opened her mouth, and nothing came out, and in that silence, I finally saw the truth sitting right there on her face, plain and undeniable, the thing she'd been burying under 9 years of lies. Then she said something I never expected. She said, "That's not what you think, and if you push this, you're going to regret finding out the rest. That's not what you think, and if you push this, you're going to regret finding out the rest." Her words hung in the air between us, cold and deliberate, not the words of a woman caught in a moment of weakness, but something closer to a threat, like she was daring me to keep pulling on a thread she knew would unravel more than just her affair. I asked her what exactly she meant by the rest, and she just shook her head and looked away, refusing to say another word, which somehow scared me more than if she'd kept lying outright. My phone buzzed again. My sister had sent the screenshots she promised, a whole folder of them, and I sat down at the kitchen table and started scrolling through months of messages between my wife and this man. Messages that went back further than I could stomach, filled with plans, hotel confirmations, inside jokes about keeping things quiet a little longer. But one message stopped me cold, dated almost a year back, where she wrote to him, "I can't leave yet, not until the house is in both our names. Then it won't matter what he finds out." I read it 3 times to make sure I understood it correctly, because it wasn't just an affair anymore. It was a plan. A calculated waiting game where my own marriage was a financial transaction she was stalling until it benefited her. I looked up at her, phone in my hand, and asked her straight out what she meant by, "until the house is in both our names." She stared at me for a long moment, and then, instead of denying it, she laughed, a short, bitter laugh that had no warmth in it at all. "You really think I was going to walk away with nothing after 9 years of pretending to love you? I'm not stupid." Hearing her say it like that, so plainly, so without shame, felt worse than any of the messages, because it meant every soft moment, every anniversary, every time she said she loved me, might have been calculated too. Then she said something that turned my stomach in an entirely different direction. She mentioned my sister's name and said, "You want to talk about trust? Ask your precious sister why she really had access to my laptop in the first place. Ask her what she was doing while you were away last spring." I felt my chest tighten, because I had no idea what she meant, and the way she said it wasn't a bluff. It was aimed like a weapon she'd been saving for exactly this moment. Something meant to make me doubt the one person who had just tried to warn me. I called my sister back immediately, my hands shaking, and asked her directly what my wife meant. There was a long pause on the line, longer than I could stand, before my sister finally said, "I was going to tell you that part too, but I didn't know how." "I was going to tell you that part too, but I didn't know how." My sister's voice cracked over the phone, and I stood frozen in my kitchen, my wife watching me from the couch with an expression I couldn't read anymore, somewhere between fear and satisfaction, like she'd finally handed me a burden heavier than her own guilt. I asked my sister to just say it, whatever it was, because I couldn't take another second of half-truths from anyone in my life right now. She took a breath and told me that last spring, while I was away for that work conference, she'd come by the house to drop off something for the kids, and she'd seen my wife's laptop open on the kitchen table with a message thread still on the screen. And it wasn't with the trainer. It was with someone else entirely, someone from my wife's job, a name I recognized instantly because he used to come to our barbecues. I felt something crack open in my chest that had nothing to do with the trainer anymore. My sister said she hadn't told me back then because it was just a handful of messages, nothing definitive, and she convinced herself she'd misread the tone, that maybe it was innocent, coworkers venting about stress. But when she saw my wife at the hotel 3 months ago with a completely different man, she realized this wasn't a single betrayal, it was a pattern, something ongoing, something my wife had built into the architecture of her daily life without ever breaking stride as a mother, as a wife, as someone who kissed me goodnight every evening like nothing was wrong. I turned to face my wife, still sitting on the couch, and asked her point blank if there was someone else besides the trainer. She didn't even flinch this time. She just stared at me with this cold, exhausted look, like she was relieved the performance was finally over. Does it matter which one you find out about first? You were never going to be enough to make me stay, not really. I just needed enough time to make sure I didn't leave broke. Hearing her say, "Which one?" confirmed there were more than two, and I felt my whole understanding of the last several years collapse in real time. Every trip she claimed was work-related, every late night at the office, every excuse rearranging itself into a timeline of betrayal I hadn't been allowed to see. I asked her how many. She didn't answer directly. She just looked at me and said, "You're going to want to sit down for the rest of this conversation, because it's not just about me anymore. It's about whose kids you've actually been raising for the last 4 years." The room went completely silent. I heard my own pulse in my ears, louder than anything else in the house, and for the first time all night, I genuinely didn't know if I wanted to hear the next sentence out of her mouth. The room went completely silent, and I heard my own pulse pounding in my ears louder than anything else in the house, because for the first time all night, I genuinely did not know if I wanted to hear the next sentence out of her mouth. I asked her to explain herself, my voice barely above a whisper, and she looked at me with an expression that had finally stopped performing sadness or anger, settling instead into something flat and almost clinical, like she was reciting facts she'd rehearsed telling herself for years just to survive her own conscience. She said our youngest, the one I'd carried on my shoulders through every birthday party, the one who had my mother's laugh according to everyone who met her, wasn't biologically mine. I sat down at the kitchen table because my legs genuinely stopped trusting themselves to hold me up. She kept talking, almost mechanically now, explaining that it happened during a rough patch 4 years ago, a period I remembered as us working through some distance after a miscarriage the year before, a period where I thought we were healing together, going to therapy, rebuilding something. She said it was a mistake, a 2-week fling with someone she barely knew, and that when she found out she was pregnant, she convinced herself the timing worked out, that I would never do the math, that it was easier to let me believe what I wanted to believe than to destroy our family over something she swore would never happen again. I asked her if my sister knew this too, if this was the secret she couldn't bring herself to say over the phone. And there was a long silence before my sister's voice came through, still on speaker, quietly admitting that she had suspected something back then, some comment my wife made once during a vulnerable moment. But she'd told herself it was grief talking, not truth. And she buried the suspicion, because she didn't want to be the reason our family fell apart, over a guess she wasn't sure about. Hearing that from my own sister, someone who had held that possibility for years while watching me raise a daughter I loved with my whole chest, added a different kind of grief to the pile forming in my stomach. One aimed not at betrayal, but at the sheer number of people who had decided silence was kinder than honesty. My wife stood up from the couch and walked toward me, and for a moment I thought she might finally show something resembling remorse. but instead she said, "I'm telling you this now because I need you to understand that if you try to take the house or the kids in a divorce, I have things on you too, things you don't even remember doing, and I will use every single one of them." I stared at her, stunned that even now, in the wreckage of her own confession, she was still calculating, still threatening, still treating our marriage like a negotiation she refused to lose. I asked her what exactly she meant by things I don't even remember doing, and the smile that crossed her face in that moment was the coldest thing I had seen all night. I felt my stomach drop, not because I believed I had done anything unforgivable, but because I truly could not remember large portions of that night. And the terrifying part of grief is how easily it lets you lose track of your own actions. She said she'd kept that story stored away for exactly this kind of moment, a bargaining chip in case I ever tried to leave her with the upper hand, and hearing her describe it so plainly, so strategically, made it clear that our entire marriage had become, at some point I couldn't pinpoint, a war she was fighting while I still believed we were building a life together. I asked her if it was true, if I had actually done something that night, and she shrugged and said, "Does it matter? People will believe what I tell them, the same way you believed me for 9 years." My sister, still on speakerphone this entire time, finally spoke up, her voice sharper now, angrier, telling my wife that she'd had enough of listening to her twist every fact into a weapon, and that she was coming over right now with the folder of messages, printed and dated, along with a friend who worked in family law, because she refused to let me sit in this house alone while my wife rewrote history in real time. My wife's face shifted at the mention of a lawyer, just slightly, just enough for me to see the calculation behind her eyes recalibrating, realizing that the story she'd controlled all night might be slipping out of her hands for the first time. She turned back to me and said, quieter now, almost pleading, "We can still fix this if you just let this go, if we handle it privately, for the kids." I looked at this woman I had loved for 9 years, and for the first time all night, I felt something other than shock or anger settle into my chest. I felt clarity. I told her there was nothing left to fix, and that whatever she thought she had on me, I would rather face it in the open than spend one more day living inside her version of the truth. Her expression changed completely, and she said one final thing before my sister's car pulled into the driveway. "You have no idea what's actually going to come out once this starts." I wasn't the only one lying in this house. "You have no idea what's actually going to come out once this starts." I wasn't the only one lying in this house. Her words landed like a slap, and before I could respond, headlights swept across the living room window as my sister's car pulled into the driveway, followed almost immediately by another car I didn't recognize. My wife's eyes darted toward the window, and for the first time all night, I saw genuine fear replace the calculated coldness she'd worn like armor for hours. My sister walked in first, folder clutched tightly in her hand, followed by a lawyer friend she'd apparently called on the drive over. And then, stepping out of the second car, someone I hadn't seen in years, my wife's own mother, her face already tight with worry before she'd even crossed the threshold. My sister explained everything quickly, her voice steady despite how shaken she looked. After the hotel sighting months ago, she'd quietly reached out to my wife's mother, hoping there might be context that could explain things away before it ever reached me. Some innocent detail that would make the whole thing a misunderstanding. Instead, her mother revealed something none of us expected. This wasn't the first marriage my wife had done this in. Years before we met, she'd been briefly married to someone else, a marriage she'd erased entirely from her own history, never once mentioned in 9 years, ending the exact same way. Affairs discovered, a paternity secret involving a different child, and a financial settlement she fought hard to secure before disappearing and rebuilding her life under a slightly altered version of her name, eventually becoming the woman I met and married 2 years later, with no idea any of it had ever existed. I stood in my own living room, absorbing the fact that the woman I had spent 9 years with had done all of this before, methodically, successfully, and had simply repeated the exact pattern with me because it had worked the first time. She didn't deny a word of it. She just stood there, cornered by her own mother's testimony, my sister's folder of evidence, and a lawyer standing quietly near the door, and for the first time all night, she had absolutely nothing left to twist in her favor. But instead of collapsing into more tears or manipulation, something in her shifted, and she said, quietly, almost exhausted, "Fine. You want the truth? All of it? Out loud? In front of everyone? Then let's do it right now, because I'm tired of carrying this alone." What followed wasn't a performance soaked in guilt, but something colder and far more useful. A full accounting. Names, dates, the actual paternity of our daughter, confirmed through a test she admitted she'd already taken in secret, months earlier, out of her own private guilt. And a confession that the affair with the trainer had only started 6 months ago, separate from everything else. Proof that this wasn't a single mistake, but a pattern she had never once tried to break across 2 marriages. Her mother, ashamed and shaking, offered to help cover the cost of a formal paternity test right away and promised to support whatever I decided about custody going forward, while my sister's lawyer friend calmly began outlining exactly what my legal footing looked like, which turned out to be far stronger than my wife's earlier threats had implied, since premeditated financial deception and a documented pattern of infidelity weakened her position far more than anything from my own past could weaken mine. I didn't feel relief standing there that night, and I didn't feel closure either, but I felt something steadier settle into my chest. Clarity about who had actually been protecting our family all along, and who had only ever been protecting herself. 6 months later, the divorce was finalized. I have full custody of both kids. My daughter still calls me dad every single morning, because biology never once changed how much I love her. The last time I saw my ex-wife was in a courtroom hallway, still trying to explain herself to someone new, though this time, no one around her was listening anymore.